Welcome to the Determined Truth Podcast.
Want the truth? You can't handle the truth.
Where we aim to explore questions of truth, the scriptures, and what it means for the church today. Here are your hosts, Rob Dalrymple and Vinnie Angelo.
Hey everyone, welcome in. We're continuing in our post-Revelation study as we're bringing on a series of scholars. And being a New Testament guy, Rob, this is the second time we've had an Old Testament professor on, an Old Testament scholar on. And it's strange that we would think on the surface, why would we bring an Old Testament guy on to talk about the book of Revelation, especially when it's all about the future?
No one else was available is the answer. So
that's what it was. So we had to settle for maybe the world's most prolific Old Testament scholar of the last number of years.
One evangelical biblical scholar in the world. Yeah, that's all.
Yeah. So who do we have on the show today?
We're so excited to have Tremper Longman on with us. By the way, Tremper's been on before in the BV era.
BV.
That's called before Vinnie. So the before Vinnie era.
The good old days, as some people call it.
Exactly. Dr. Tremper Longman, the third, by the way, has a Ph.D. from Yale University. He's the distinguished scholar and professor emeritus of biblical studies at Westmont College. Written over 35 books, and he's edited like 150 other bazillion books, I think, as well, Tremper, including commentaries on Genesis, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Daniel, Nahum, and Revelation. Among his recent books include Confronting Old Testament Controversies, Pressing Questions about Evolution, Sexuality, History, and Violence, which we interviewed you on, Tremper, on that book, on the podcast. I think it was in 2019. So if you go back to the archives there. And he's also written, which we're going to talk to him about today, Reading Revelation Through Old Testament Eyes. He also has a book coming out soon. I think it just appeared with Baker Books called The Old Testament as Literature. He's the senior translator for the New Living Translation. Married to his wife, Alice, who I got to meet the other day, and she's a wonderful lady. And I don't know how you did it, Tremper, but you did well. He has 3 sons and 7 granddaughters and a grandson. And he and his wife, Alice, now live in Alexandria, Virginia. Tremper, thank you so much for being with us.
Great to be with you, Rob and Vinnie. Very glad to be here.
Thank
Even
you so
though
much.
I'm talking to a real Revelation expert here.
Oh, yeah. I thought you were going to say you're talking to a Patriot fan and a Raider fan, and we're going to start with a joke. A Patriot fan, a Raider fan, and an Eagle fan entered a bar.
I was just going to say that.
And who knows what happens. So
exactly.
Anyways, I couldn't hear you, Vinnie. I have the Super Bowl rings were in my ear. I couldn't hear you. Okay. Trevor, let's just start. First off, Tremper, I think you told me a couple of years ago that you were writing a commentary on the book of Revelation when we met a couple of years ago in D.C. And I'm like, oh, that's odd. Tremper's an Old Testament scholar. How's he going to do that? And then I got your commentary and I'm like, this is fantastic because it really is. Reading Revelation through Old Testament eyes is phenomenal. I think we discussed the other day was that you're in your niche when you're in Lamentations or the old Psalms and Genesis, and you stay in that niche. And New Testament scholars stay in that niche. But you bring to the book of Revelation this Old Testament perspective that's so illuminating and so helpful. So I want to thank you for that. But let's just start with the first question. What do you think is the big picture message of the book of Revelation?
Yeah, the big picture message of the book of Revelation, and this is brought to my mind, reading it particularly in the light of Daniel, which I think has the same big picture message, which is in spite of present difficulties, in spite of the fact that the church is being marginalized, oppressed, persecuted, God is really in control, even though it doesn't look like God's in control. God is in control, and he's going to have the final victory. Whatever you do, stay faithful. Don't cave in to those cultural, societal, political forces which are trying to get you to ditch the faith. So I think that's the big message of the book of Revelation. And of course, it's doing that by talking about Christ's second coming, ultimately. So I think what it's describing is not just some future events, but rather it's talking about how the church lives in a difficult culture up until the very end. So yeah, I'm sure we'll get into more detail about it later. But when Christ came the first time, many people, including John the Baptist, thought that this is the time God's going to set everything right again. But he didn't realize with what he said, that is John the Baptist was true, but he didn't realize that Christ's coming was a two-part affair.
I'm curious, as you answered that, Tremper, especially you had mentioned John reading Daniel and Daniel's influence there, and especially as an Old Testament scholar, and you've written a ton on Daniel. We mentioned that a few weeks ago, Rob. Tremper's commentaries on Daniel. We've never discussed on this podcast, Rob, Daniel's use of apocalypse. I know you've done some teaching that's like way back in the before Vinnie age, but I don't think we've talked about Daniel and apocalyptic literature. And we've talked about apocalyptic literature for Revelation. But Tremper, could you give us an overview on how we can understand apocalyptic literature in the Old Testament? Because Revelation seems so different. What are the similarities? What's the continuity between Daniel and Revelation, specifically from a genre standpoint?
Yeah, well, there's a great deal of similarity between particularly Daniel 7 to 12 and the book of Revelation, as both are talking about the future using heavy imagery, figurative language. And that's one of the things I think reading the book of Revelation in the light of the Old Testament helps us see is the genre question, because genre triggers reading strategy. Authors are sending us signals as to how we should take their word. And one of the big take-homes of that is expect a lot of figurative language, including figurative uses of numbers and things like that. That rather than trying to think that this is describing something that's literally going to happen in the future, or turning the locusts into helicopters or something like that, Chinese helicopters, which is what I
No one would say that.
I became a Christian back in the late 60s, early 70s after reading Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey, which I could totally object to his hermeneutics today, but he got the bottom line right, that Christ is coming again, and if you're on the wrong side, that's a problem. And I was on the wrong side at that time.
Wow.
I think that's helpful, because I know for me, until I started studying genre, which is not something you normally study from a layperson's perspective. You don't get into that unless you go to Bible college or seminary. And so you assume that obviously that literal hermeneutic. And so it's not till years later that I actually started figuring out, there's this genre thing that's happening. And with Revelation, I think it makes sense. But with Daniel, I don't know if we think of it in terms of those terms of, it's still an apocalypse. Correct me if I'm even trying to think. I don't think he uses the word apocalypse in Daniel, whereas in Revelation, it's obviously the first word of the book.
Yeah, of course, apocalypse comes from a Greek word. So they didn't coin the word, but you can. And with most books of the Old and New Testament, they don't name the genre. You just recognize the genre from its similarity to other writings. Now, I would say that Daniel 7 to 12 is the only really true apocalypse in the Old Testament. But there are a lot of other apocalyptic writings that are outside the Bible that also help us understand the genre. The Gospels in the New Testament are about as close to a unique genre in the Bible, but I would argue they're not even unique in that sense. God uses everyday genres because the reader needs to know something about a genre in order to interpret a book correctly. So we shouldn't be surprised that we see non-biblical apocalypses, just like we have non-biblical letters and that we compare to the New Testament letters. And by the way, this book that's just coming out next week, actually, the Old Testament literature, has a chapter dedicated to the importance of genre. And so I think it is helpful for everyday Bible readers should become more self-conscious about their reading, how they're reading biblical books. And of course, that's why we all write books, to help in that regard.
Yeah, just to clarify for those who are listening, genre just means the style of writing. And Tremper made the comment about it just clues you in, like once upon a time. As soon as you see once upon a time, now you know what to expect. It's going to have a princess. She's going to be in duress. There might even be a dragon. There's going to be a prince who's going to save her. From the clues, from the verbal clues, what to expect in it, or you open up the sports page back in the day when they had newspapers, and winning and losing means something different than winning and losing on the front page of the newspaper. So that's what genre does. It helps tie you in there. Tremper, I like to use the idea of apocalyptic literature and say there's often this cosmic upheaval language as if the cosmos is going to be destroyed or decimated, or to say when God breaks in history and does something of covenantal significance to his promises, where the heavens are rolled back like a scroll and there's an earthquake. Yeah. Is that fair enough with Daniel and elsewhere?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. There are a lot of other features of apocalyptic literature, including strong dualism between good and evil, and also contrasts heaven and earthly realities and so forth. But I think one of the most important things for readers to understand is this idea of, I'm going to expect a lot of figurative language here. I got actually an email just yesterday from somebody, and I'll mess up the details, but in one vision in Revelation, the day turns to night, and in another one, it's day and night. And of course, it's Isaiah 60, verse 10 to 12. And they were saying these two can't be both true. And it's like, it's a metaphor.
Yeah.
Oh, that's helpful to not think that it is describing some actual future physical reality when it's talking about the day turning to night or whatever.
Hey everyone, we want to thank you for joining us on today's podcast. And we want to remind you that everything we provide at Determined Truth is free of charge. And this even includes all of the teaching that Rob does on a weekly basis to pastors in India and around the world. We don't have any supporters that get special behind the scenes access. But we can only do this with the generous support that comes from those of you who can afford to give. So if you would prayerfully consider supporting us with anything from $5 a month or more, we will continue to work hard to challenge the church to be the church. To give, go to determinedtruth.com and click on the Give tab, or follow the link in the show notes. So outside of the apocalyptic genre specifically, and looking at Daniel, how does understanding John's use of the Old Testament, this is a bigger question now, so it's not just apocalyptic specific, but how does understanding John's use of the Old Testament elucidate our understanding of the apocalypse, of John's apocalypse?
Yeah, what I like to say, and it's an overstatement to make my point, is that modern readers have a lot of trouble with Revelation. They read it and it's really strange. And I say, it's really strange to you because you're not in the world of the Old Testament and the ancient Near East. If you are conversant with imagery and so forth from the past, it won't be as strange to you as you think it is. I'm thinking, for instance, of Revelation 1, verse 7, which pictures Christ riding a cloud. And where's that come from? First of all, it comes from the Old Testament, where in Daniel, most directly from Daniel 7, 13, and 14, which is this scene where, after a description of the four beasts, which also, of course, informs imagery in the book of Revelation, you have a picture of the Ancient of Days sitting on his throne, and into his presence, riding a cloud, is one like the Son of Man. Before that, there are a whole bunch of texts that talk about Yahweh riding a cloud, whether it's Psalm 104, Psalm 68, Isaiah 19, Nahum chapter 1, and so forth. And so what you realize is it's a God who rides a cloud. And what even some Old Testament, what a lot of Old Testament readers don't understand is that imagery is actually coming from the broader ancient Near East. And we see this particularly in connection the god Baal, who in Ugaritic, quasi-Canaanite related mythology rides the cloud because he's a storm god. So storm gods ride a cloud. It's like the divine war chariot. And so the Old Testament is appropriating this imagery, storm god imagery, and applying it to Yahweh and saying, Baal's nothing. He claims to be the power of the storm, but it's really Yahweh's the power of the storm. And now we see Jesus in the New Testament being pictured. And of course, also in Mark 13 and related texts, he it talks about him coming back on the cloud. Some imagery, it uses imagery from the Old Testament for the first time. Yeah, and we could go on and on about that.
Yeah. So do you see that the New Testament in general, the book of Revelation in particular, taking that imagery applied to the Father or God, right, in the Old Testament, and now applying it to Christ?
Yeah.
And second part of that question is, what do you make of the fact that in chapter 14 of Revelation, he's riding on a white cloud? Because it's not a storm cloud.
Yeah, and that's the only time. And that did throw me as a little bit of a loop there, because typically in the Old Testament, it doesn't describe the color of the cloud, but it's clearly a dark cloud, a storm cloud. Psalm 18 is another good example of Yahweh riding a cloud and lightning's coming from it.
Yeah,
exactly.
So
yeah, so what to make of it? I wasn't sure exactly what to make of it, except to note that it's because back in I don't know when it was painted, but back in the 60s and 70s, when I first became a Christian, there was this very popular picture of a very serene looking Christ standing on a white cloud, holding a nicely washed white sheep. And I used to make fun of it because we're talking about, typically the cloud is dark. And what do you make of it, Rob? Did you?
I didn't explore that deeply. John does seem to be using colors to have same way he uses numbers with a theological significance. He's using color. So the only thing I think we would make out of it would be white's purity. Garments in chapter 7 have been washed white in the blood of the Lamb. I think that's probably the only thing that we would do. But I actually didn't explore that. I left colors out of the discussion. But I think that's where we would probably end up going. Yeah, good question. So let's talk a little bit then in terms of, certainly Daniel's of importance, right? If you're not aware, if you're listening here, in terms of the number of citations in the book of Revelation, I think Daniel is up at the top of the list there. But other Old Testament texts that you think are as important, or where do you go with that?
I would say that there are a lot of books that are important, but I would also highlight Ezekiel. The descriptions of Jesus in chapter 1, and we're talking about different glowing metals and his voice rumbling water and all that kind of stuff. It's not a direct taking of language describing Yahweh and applying it to Jesus, but there are definite allusions there. Or Yahweh, Jesus on his throne in Revelation 5 has a lot of Old Testament echoes of God on the throne of Daniel 7, for instance, the Ancient of Days sitting on the throne. But it also in Ezekiel, the initial theophany, God is on the throne. And then, of course, there's the scroll itself, which we may want to talk about more later. But the 7 sealed scroll in Revelation 5 and following, and then the little scroll in Revelation 10. And so Ezekiel is another good example. Exodus is an important example too, because a lot of the judgments come in the form that's similar to the plagues against Egypt. And there's also 2 or 3 references to the people of God as referring to the people of God as a kingdom and as priests, which relates back to Exodus 19. And where Israel's called a kingdom of priests. Then also Psalms, both just in terms, there's a lot of worshiping God going on in Revelation, right? I focus in on the judgment and the darkness, but it also leads the people of God to praise because, again, in spite of present difficulties, God's going to have the final victory. And that's a reason, which reminds me that one of the first things I read about apocalyptic as a genre was its pessimism. But way back when I was in seminary, I remember reading
that's true,
pessimism because it's talking about the coming judgment. And I'm sitting there going, it's not pessimistic if you're on the right side of that.
Exactly, If you're pessimistic, like as far as the world's concerned, but
so it's actually quite optimistic. So Psalms, and then the celebration of Jesus as Messiah, applying Psalm to Jesus in the book of Revelation too. So I guess those 4 books in
Yeah, okay.
particular are important.
Very good, very good.
You had mentioned Revelation 5 and the scrolls with the 7 seals.
Yeah.
Let's dive into that a little bit. Do you see a connection between Daniel chapter 12 and his scroll, and a connection with the scroll that Jesus has?
Yes. I see the connection in that. Daniel 12. Let me turn to it.
Yeah, go ahead and read it if you want.
I usually use my iPad, but I got a new copy of the New Living Translation, which
of which you are one of the senior editors for. As this program is brought to you by the New Living Translation.
Yeah, I'm also heading out on Saturday for a big week-long meeting of the Central Bible Translation Committee. Yes, it says, just give me a second, and this is big print. They sent me a big I just got it a couple days ago. There's a scroll that is written up, but it's sealed.
Yeah.
It's sealed, and Daniel's interested in how this is all going to play out. And the angel says to him, yeah, just go live your life. It'll be unscrolled at the end of time. And then, of course, what we see in Revelation 5 is that the one who's worthy to open the scroll seals this scroll, which is clearly a scroll that has judgments, as we read on in the passage. And therefore, it's also related to that Ezekiel 2 scroll, which is full of lament and mourning and woe. And then, especially in Revelation 10, when John is told to eat the scroll, and Ezekiel's told to eat the scroll way back in Ezekiel 3, and it turns sour because it's full of judgment. So, in answer to your question, Vinnie, there is, in my mind, a connection between those 2 scrolls.
Would you go so far?
Yeah, go ahead.
What?
I was just going to say there is a question about the relationship between the scroll in Ezekiel, Revelation 5 and Revelation 10. And I go back and forth on that.
Okay, all right.
But on the other hand, I don't think it makes a big difference, because I think in both cases there are scrolls with judgment on them. But the thing that kind of unites the 2 is, of course, they're both scrolls, and there's a mighty angel that draws a connection between them. Though mighty angel is a generic term, so it doesn't have to be the same angel, but it could be the same angel. But the reference to little scroll might create a difference between the 2, though I think it's Bauckham says that even though it is the diminutive, doesn't mean it has to be small. So on the one hand, that's one of a couple things I kept going back and forth on.
Okay, but I got a long part of in my commentary on that, and I'll share it with you when we go offline.
Well, why not share it with us now?
Okay, sure, I can do that. Yeah. I argued, and I think we've done it on the podcast as well, that for one, a narratival reading demands it to be the same scroll, because in chapter 5, the scroll is so important that John's weeping that no one can open it up. And so what the contents are, you don't know the contents until it's all fully unsealed. And he finally unseals the whole thing. Okay, what's on the scroll? And then we're not told, because all of a sudden there's 7 trumpets. And when you see the scroll open in chapter 10, it's clearly the one that was unsealed in chapter 6 and 7, or 6 in the beginning of chapter 8. And so narratively, it makes the most sense. And then, as you and I chatted a little bit in our Uber ride the other day, that John's using words and linking passages together by using keywords only in certain passages. So he does use strong angel or mighty angel 7 times, but once in chapter 5, and then 5 times in chapter 10. It's a clear link there. So I think narratively, it almost demands it's the same scroll. And then the verbal links. And then the third thing I discussed, and I won't go into detail here, but that technically, biblioribion, however you say it, there are actually 2 different forms of the diminutive. They're actually both diminutives.
Okay.
It's not like he uses a regular and a diminutive. He uses the regular form, which is biblos, later on. So he knows the regular form. He's alternating between the 2 different diminutive form, and diminutive for the listeners just means like it's a small book or a little book. That'd be a diminutive. So I think actually he's just using interchangeably the 2 different forms of the same word. So that's the key argument, that they are different scrolls. By the way, Vern Poitras, my mentor, argues that they're 2 different books. No, they're not. They have to be the same scroll, though.
Maybe that's why in the back of my mind, because I
Yeah.
had learned as a professor too.
That's true, yeah.
When he was very young, probably was resonating. But on the other hand, I don't make a big deal about whether they're the same or different, though you've convinced me. I should have talked to you before.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, and I just think the narrative demands this. And I think the other thing I would add, by the way, and we don't have to go off on this, is I understand the idea the scroll has judgment, but I think what it is, it's the question of, and tell me what you think of it. This is what I argue in my commentary, so it's too late to edit it now, but is that it's God's will. It's how is God going to bring the redemption of creation and the restoration of creation about? That's what's on the scroll. And John eats it, and then he prophesies the two witnesses. That's the answer. It's going to be through the ministry of the two witnesses, and it's going to be through the loving, faithful, sacrificial witness of God's people, and not judgment, because judgment doesn't bring repentance. That's where I go in my commentary, and that's why I titled that Revelation a Love Story.
Yeah.
So,
well, and I like that, though. Okay. I would probably say that the message of the church, which I think is what the two witnesses has just like the message of Jesus, is double-sided. It either brings repentance and reconciliation, or brings judgment. And judgment too, we find it difficult, I think, especially in 21st century America, to think of judgment and the violence associated with it, a positive thing. But I think in the biblical worldview, and I think in most of the world today, particularly in oppressed and persecuted communities, the idea of God's judgment is connected with the idea of God's justice and setting things right. So see, you're going to have your listening audience two good resources out there.
There you go. Absolutely.
We hope you're enjoying the podcast, and we want to remind you that everything we do at Determined Truth, the podcast, Rob's blog, and our YouTube channel, is available on the Determined Truth app. Directions on how to download the app is available in the show notes and on the determinedtruth.com website. Just click on the app tab.
All right, so let's move to what we discussed a little bit before. You brought it up as well. The beast of Revelation 13 is clearly building off of Daniel chapter 7 and the four beasts there. What do you think the beast of Revelation 13, or let's start with that. Who or what is the beast in Daniel 7? Let's start there. Or the four beasts.
So in Daniel 7, you have a series of four beasts. The last one I call Robo Beast because, anachronistically, because while the other ones are all described in relationship to known animals, the only kind of physical description I think we get of the fourth beast is iron teeth and then later iron claws, or vice versa. Mm-hmm. And of course it's describing an unimaginably evil and destructive force. Mm-hmm. And so I think all the beasts represent evil human kingdoms.
Okay.
And I don't identify them with particular nations.
Oh, okay, interesting.
There's a whole kind of cottage industry, or there's a debate between those who say the first beast is Babylon, then the Medes, then the Persians, then the Greeks, and then the little horn is Antiochus Epiphanes, or in the 2nd century, or it's the Babylon, the Medo-Persian Empire, the Greeks, and then the Romans, and then the little horn is the Antichrist. Mm-hmm. I think the imagery is more basically saying that until the end of time, there's going to be a succession of evil human kingdoms. So we shouldn't be saying, oh, the fourth beast is Rome, and then the 10 horns are successive emanations from the empire. So that's what I think about that. And then the beasts in the book of Revelation are the agents of the dragon, who in Revelation 12:9 is identified as the devil. And I think that the sea beast, and it is an unholy trinity too.
Yeah, I agree.
See that where the dragon, Satan, is the father figure, and then the sea beast has connections with this Jesus, and the third beast is testifying to the land beast. Sounds like the Holy Spirit, but it's an unholy trinity. I think that the sea beast represents evil human kingdom, starting in speaking to their contemporary audience, Rome.
Mhm.
But it applies to, I think, in a sense, to every nation state, which not that I think that every nation state is equally evil, but I also think that as people put their trust in a human nation state, even if it is, say, America, or wants to work to make America a Christian nation, as it supposedly but really wasn't at its founding, that it becomes an idol. And then the land beast is a propaganda mechanism for idolatry, essentially. That's how I understand it.
Yeah, very good.
And
I'm curious on that, Tremper, because I haven't read your commentary in years, so I'm trying to remember where you landed on the identification of the four beasts in your commentary. But was that your perspective when you had your commentary, or did you
You're
have
talking about the Daniel commentary?
Yeah, the Daniel commentary. I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay.
Do you hold the same position that you did then, or have you shifted? Did you hold maybe a Greek or a Roman view then? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I held the same view. Now,
okay.
One of the reasons why I have been pretty prolific, and I have competitors in being prolific. I think of John Walton, John Golden, Walter Brueggemann. So I may not be the most prolific. As a matter of fact, I think John Goldengay is breaking all records at the moment. I just edited his forthcoming Ezekiel commentary. And it's all great stuff. Everything they both do is really interesting. Though John's getting a little edgy on some things. I don't always agree with him, but he's always worth reading. No, I hold the same view then as now. And what I was about to say was, after I finish the Daniel commentary, I start working on other things. So it's not like I'm sitting around reconsidering. I have to. I'm doing the second edition of my Ecclesiastes commentary, which came out in the 90s. So I'm reading all the literature that's come out since then, and it's been fun, partly because I get cited a lot, which is good.
There you go.
Not always positively, but better to be cited negatively than ignored. And I should also say that one of the reasons why I adopted it is my interest in at least quasi or apocalyptic literature goes all the way back to my Yale dissertation that I finished in 1983, which is on fictional Acadian autobiographies. Y'all ought to run out and buy the public.
I'll put the link in
the
show notes.
But some of those ancient Babylonian, Assyrian texts, I think these are all Babylonian, and with something like apocalyptic. And one of them, called the Dynastic Prophecy, has a 4-kingdom schema in it. So it seems as if, and then of course people will often point to Hesiod, 4 ages, and there's some other examples. There seems to be this idea of 4, not to say 4, but to say a succession of things. And it's also interesting that in Daniel 7, I haven't quite figured out what to make of it. Remember that when the one like the Son of Man destroys the 4th one, the other 3 are still around. Some people think that maybe the 4th kingdom has imbibed, which is true. The Persian Empire engulfs the Babylonian Empire. Empire defeats the Persian Empire and grows, and the Roman Empire supersedes the Greek Empire. So it's interesting to think about, but it doesn't affect the bottom line of the message.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the book of Revelation 4 is consistently used for the creation, the 4 east, north, southeast, whatever. And so maybe that's what's going on in Daniel also. What do you think of that?
Yeah. I think so.
It's a symbolic number for totality of all the nations. Okay.
All right, guys. So this episode ended up going really long. This interview went really long. So we're going to split this into 2. So this is part 1 of our interview with Tremper on his commentary on the Revelation through Old Testament eyes. And next week, we'll come back with part 2 of that. Anything you want to add, Rob?
No, next week's episode, we're going to discuss a lot of what does this mean for us today part of it as well. Yeah. So I think it'll be a great conversation.
All right, guys. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week. I want to thank you for joining us on today's podcast, and we would love for you to share the work of Determined Truth with others. please follow this podcast and give a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Your review will go a long way towards helping others find this podcast. Then share it with others so that we can get the word of the gospel of the kingdom to more people.